There was one thing about my grandfather that used to drive everyone crazy. He could spend $20 and somehow make it feel like he was making one of the biggest decisions of his week. Whether he was buying groceries, gas, or a simple pair of work gloves, Grandpa never rushed. While everyone else reached for their wallets, he'd pause. Sometimes he'd put the item back and walk away. As a kid, I thought he was simply cheap. My father would laugh and shake his head. The old man will spend 10 minutes deciding whether to buy a $5 wrench. Grandpa never argued. He'd just smile, tuck his wallet back into his pocket and say, "Money likes people who don't chase it." None of us knew what that meant. At least, not then. The strange part was that Grandpa wasn't afraid to spend money. When something truly mattered, he never hesitated. If someone truly needed help, Grandpa never hesitated. He would quietly pay for repairs, supplies, or anything important without making a big deal about it. So it was never about refusing to spend. It was about deciding when spending deserved a yes. That difference seemed small. Years later, I realized it explained almost everything about the way he lived. While most people believed money problems started with not earning enough, Grandpa believed they usually started much earlier. They started in the few quiet seconds between seeing something and deciding to pay for it. Back then, I couldn't understand why those few seconds mattered so much. Today, I think they were the most valuable part of his entire financial philosophy. Over the next 50 years, banking became faster. Cards replaced cash. Online payments replaced waiting. Eventually, buying something became almost effortless. But Grandpa never changed his pace. He once told me something that sounded almost ridiculous. The faster money leaves your hands, the less likely it is to come back. I laughed. How could speed possibly matter? A purchase was a purchase, whether it took 5 seconds or 5 minutes. Or at least, that's what I believed. It wasn't until years later, after I found myself wondering where my own paycheck kept disappearing every month, that I remembered those words. I wasn't wasting money on anything dramatic, yet somehow, every month ended the same way. The money simply vanished. That's when I began thinking about Grandpa again. Somehow, the man who lived through recessions and rising prices had never seemed to panic about money. I started asking family members about him. Everyone remembered something different. My grandmother remembered how he planned every grocery trip before leaving the house. My dad remembered how he'd walk one full lap around the store before buying anything unplanned. At first, those stories didn't seem connected. Then one conversation changed everything. An elderly friend of Grandpa's laughed when I mentioned how slowly he used to shop. He wasn't slow, the man said. He was giving himself time to let temptation get tired. I'd never heard anyone describe spending that way before. Temptation gets tired. Those 3 words changed how I saw Grandpa's habits. He wasn't fighting prices. He was fighting the invisible pressure behind every purchase. And once you understand what he saw all those years ago, his strange little shopping habits begin to make perfect sense. Most people assumed Grandpa avoided banks. That wasn't true. He had a checking account, paid bills, and even knew his local bank manager. Grandpa wasn't against banks. He simply refused to let them decide how he handled his money. As banking became easier, he became more careful. When the first ATM arrived in town, everyone talked about how convenient it was. Grandpa smiled. Convenience, he said, was a wonderful servant, but a terrible financial advisor. A few years later came debit cards, then online banking, then phones that could move money with a single tap. Every new invention promised the same thing: spend faster, pay faster, borrow faster. Most people celebrated that speed. Grandpa quietly moved in the opposite direction. He believed something almost nobody else did. The bank should store your money, he'd say. It should never decide how quickly it leaves. Years later, I finally understood the question Grandpa had been asking all along. What if saving time wasn't always saving money? What if those extra few seconds gave you something far more valuable than convenience? That's when I remembered watching him at the grocery store. There was one strange habit he practiced before almost every purchase. But once I understood why he did it, I realized it was the foundation of the cash method that banks, apps, and one-click checkouts still can't replace. Because the real lesson had nothing to do with cash itself. It had everything to do with one small pause almost everyone skips. The first time Grandpa explained his cash method to me, at the age of 12, it wasn't at home or at a bank, but in a crowded grocery store. I had tossed a box of cookies into the shopping cart without asking. Grandpa looked down at it. He didn't scold me. He didn't tell me to put it back. Instead, he smiled and pushed the cart a little farther. "We'll see if you still want it when we finish shopping." That was it. No lecture, no argument. By the time we reached the checkout line nearly half an hour later, I'd completely forgotten about the cookies. Grandpa quietly placed the box back on a nearby shelf as we walked out. On the drive home, he finally spoke. "Most things don't lose their value while you're shopping." At the time, I thought he was talking about cookies. Years later, I realized he was talking about almost everything people buy. Grandpa believed every purchase had two prices: the number printed on the tag and the decision hiding behind it. Today, psychologists call it impulse buying. Research shows that even a short delay can reduce emotional spending. Grandpa didn't know the science. He simply discovered the habit decades earlier. That's why he almost never bought something the moment he picked it up. He wasn't trying to save a few dollars. He was making sure the decision belonged to him, not the excitement of the moment. Looking back, I think that's why his cash method survived while so many budgeting systems came and went. It depended on one simple question: would I still choose this if I waited? That question cost nothing. Yet it quietly saved him hundreds of purchases over a lifetime. And here's the interesting part. Grandpa told me that this wasn't even the most important habit. According to him, there was another reason he preferred carrying cash, one that had nothing to do with budgeting and everything to do with how our brains react when money becomes invisible. When I finally understood that lesson, I stopped wondering why his old method still worked after 50 years and started wondering why so many of us abandoned it in the first place. A few years later, I noticed something else that made even less sense. Grandpa always knew exactly how much cash he had before opening his wallet. Not approximately. Exactly, he'd reach into his pocket and say, "I've got $32 today." Then he'd open the wallet. $32. Every single time. I finally asked him how he did it. He laughed. "I count it when I put it in." Then he said something that didn't make much sense until I was an adult. Money should never surprise you. At first, I thought he simply had a good memory, but after paying closer attention, it was awareness. Every bill passed through his hands twice. Once when he earned it, once before he spent it. That tiny habit forced him to acknowledge every dollar as something real, not just a number sitting in an account somewhere. Today, behavioral economists have a name for something very similar. They call it the pain of paying. When we hand over physical cash, our brains tend to register the loss more clearly than when we tap a card or click a button online. It's one reason many people spend more when payment feels effortless. Grandpa never read those studies. He simply trusted what he noticed. Cash made him think. Convenience made people hurry. That's why he wasn't impressed when stores started advertising faster checkout. Everyone else saw speed as a benefit. Grandpa quietly asked a different question. Who benefits most when spending becomes too easy? The answer surprised me. It wasn't really the customer. It was everyone hoping the customer would buy one more thing. Another snack by the register, another tool on sale, another shirt that wasn't on the shopping list. None of those purchases seemed expensive on their own, but Grandpa used to compare them to tiny leaks in a wooden bucket. "You don't notice the first drip," he'd say. "You notice the empty bucket." That image stayed with me, because if you've ever reached the end of the month wondering where your paycheck went, it usually wasn't one enormous mistake. Grandpa believed the wallet wasn't there just to carry money. It was there to slow those decisions down long enough for your common sense to catch up with your emotions. But there was one habit of his that puzzled me more than anything else. It happened every Friday afternoon. He would take out every bill from his wallet. As a child, I thought it was another one of his harmless routines. Years later, I realized it was probably the most powerful part of his entire cash method. And once you understand why he never skipped that Friday ritual, you'll see why his system kept working no matter how much banks, technology, or the economy changed. There were no spreadsheets, no calculator, no notebook filled with numbers. He'd simply empty every bill onto the table. 20s, 10s, 5s, singles, then he'd stack them into neat little piles. At first, I thought he was counting how much money he had left. But after watching him for weeks, I realized something strange. He already knew the total. He wasn't counting his money. He was reviewing his decisions. Sometimes he'd pick up a receipt from his pocket, look at it for a moment, smile, then throw it away. Other times he'd shake his head and quietly mutter, "Didn't need that one." No guilt, no frustration, just awareness. One evening I finally asked him why he did it every single Friday. He slid one of the dollar bills across the table toward me. "What do you remember buying with this?" I stared at it. "It's just $1. Grandpa smiled. "Exactly." Then he leaned back in his chair. "We remember expensive mistakes. We almost never remember the small ones." That sentence has stayed with me for years, because he was right. Ask someone about the car they regret buying. They'll probably remember every detail. Ask them where $50 disappeared last week. Most couldn't tell you. Grandpa believed financial problems rarely arrived wearing a name tag. They showed up disguised as ordinary habits. A coffee here, a snack there, a subscription nobody canceled, a few dollars that didn't seem worth thinking about. By themselves, they looked harmless. Together, they quietly shaped the future. Today, personal finance experts often encourage people to review their spending regularly, not to punish themselves, but to notice patterns. That's exactly what Grandpa had been doing long before budgeting apps ever existed. He wasn't checking whether he was perfect. He was checking whether his spending still matched the life he wanted. There's an important difference. One creates guilt. The other creates clarity. Looking back, I think that's why his method never felt restrictive. He wasn't asking, "How can I spend less?" He was asking, "Did I spend on what actually mattered?" Those are two completely different questions. And here's what surprised me the most. After 50 years of using cash, Grandpa wasn't proud of how much money he had saved. He was proud of how few purchases he regretted. I didn't understand why until one afternoon when we walked past a store window. He stopped, looked at something inside, smiled, and kept walking. He could have easily afforded it, so why didn't he buy it? His answer revealed the one rule that made every other part of his cash method work. And once I heard it, I realized Grandpa had never been trying to collect more money. He had been protecting something far more valuable than money itself. The last lesson Grandpa ever taught me about money happened without him spending a single dollar. We were walking through a small hardware store. I noticed him stop in front of a brand new toolbox. It was solid, well built. The kind of thing I knew he would have appreciated. He picked it up, opened every drawer, checked the hinges, ran his hand across the handle. For a moment, I was certain he was going to buy it. Instead, he closed the lid, set it back exactly where he found it, and started walking toward the exit. I couldn't help asking, "You've been using the same toolbox forever. You actually need this one. So why not buy it?" Grandpa smiled. "I probably do." Then he looked back at the toolbox one last time. "But not today." That answer frustrated me. If you already know you'll need it, why wait? He opened the truck door before answering, "Because if I still believe I need it tomorrow, I'll buy it tomorrow. But if I only want it today, I've already saved my money." It sounded almost too simple. Years later, I realized it was the rule that held every other habit together. Grandpa never confused wanting something with needing it immediately. He gave every unplanned purchase one chance to survive a little time. Sometimes it survived. Many times it didn't. And that tiny pause quietly protected thousands of dollars over a lifetime. Today, people call it the 24-hour rule. Financial advisors often recommend waiting before making non-essential purchases because delaying the decision reduces emotional spending and leads to better choices. Grandpa never called it a rule. To him, it was simply common sense. He once told me, "If something is truly useful today, it'll probably still be useful tomorrow." I've never forgotten that. Looking back, I finally understand why his cash method kept working while so many financial trends came and went. It wasn't because cash is magical. It wasn't because banks were hiding some secret. And it certainly wasn't because Grandpa had discovered a loophole. His real advantage was something technology still can't automate. He refused to let speed make his decisions. Banks became faster. Cards became easier. Phones made spending almost effortless. But Grandpa kept one thing exactly the same. He always gave himself enough time to think. I think that's the part people miss. Most financial advice focuses on where your money goes. Grandpa focused on how it left. Slowly, deliberately, one thoughtful decision at a time. Over 50 years, that habit did more than protect his savings. It protected his peace of mind. Today, I can pay for almost anything with a single tap. Sometimes I still do. But every now and then, just before I press that button, I hear Grandpa's voice in the back of my mind. Don't let convenience make the decision for you. It's amazing how often that one sentence changes my mind. Maybe that's why the banks never really beat Grandpa's cash method. Not because he avoided banks. He used them, not because he rejected technology. He accepted the parts that helped him, but because he understood something every generation has to learn for itself. Money doesn't disappear all at once. It leaves one decision at a time. And every decision becomes a little better when you slow down long enough to make it yourself. That, I believe, was Grandpa's real legacy. Not the old wallet, not the cash, not even the money he saved. It was the quiet habit of thinking before spending. And after more than 50 years, I finally understand why Grandpa could spend $20 like it was a major decision. He wasn't afraid of spending money. He was making sure every dollar knew where it was going. That's still one investment that pays the best return of all.